Until the government itself stops greenwashing, then we've got very little chance of addressing greenwashing by industry.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And to address the climate crisis, what we really need is policies with climate integrity. But rather than making actual real changes to their business practices to bring down their emissions, too often companies and governments are taking the easy road. In response to a proliferation of bogus claims about sustainability and carbon neutrality, there's a global crackdown underway on greenwashing.
Many of us want to do what we can to slow the effects of climate change.
Greenwashing is a tactic used by companies to convince customers that they're doing good for the environment.
Or it's a company misleading you with false claims to get your money, which is also known as greenwashing.
A glimpse at supermarket shelves shows that climate neutral is now more fashionable than organic.
European Union parliamentarians on Wednesday voted overwhelmingly in favour of a new directive that bans misleading environmental claims about products.
Earlier this year, the European Union decisively voted to end corporate greenwashing starting in 2026.
We want to make order in this jungle of labels so that consumers will have confidence that they buy something that is really eco-friendly.
The European Parliament has introduced greenwashing laws, and we've seen an increase in greenwashing litigation globally. Here in Australia, key regulators have made tackling greenwashing a priority, but not everyone seems to have got the message, not even all arms of government. In 2022, the Australia Institute published a report called State-Sponsored Greenwash, exposing the deliberate policy mechanisms that have led to fossil fuel companies in this country being able to make misleading claims about being climate leaders. And just last week, our Climate and Energy Director, Polly Hemming, gave evidence at the Senate inquiry into greenwashing, explaining that until the Australian government stops its own greenwashing, it's going to be very hard to hold the private sector to account. Polly joins me in the studio today to tell us more. G'day, Polly.
G'day,
Thanks for joining us. I want to start out with a quick definition of greenwashing. I think most people will have a sense, but what kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, there's no legislated definition of greenwashing, and that's kind of one of the problems, that no one can actually kind of give it a legal definition. But very broadly, greenwashing is when you are making a claim about your product or your operations and the environmental credentials of those things in terms of, are they helping the environment or helping the climate, that might not be true or might be exaggerated. But it's kind of a spectrum, because I think greenwashing kind of also extends to those claims by companies who say that they are kind of critical to Australian culture. So you see a lot of gas companies, for example, or fossil fuel companies who aren't actually saying, well, they are, but you see companies like Ampol making the claim, we're about progress or we're part of Australian history, to sort of show how they've been propping up the Australian way of life for years, which is, as so much of our research shows, isn't true.
Absolute bunk, in fact.
Not technically greenwashing, but it's kind of exaggerating the benefit they have to our lives.
With Amplified Premium Fuels and AmpCharge electric vehicle charging rolling out across Australia, Ampol powers our way of life.
So it's companies basically trying to say, look at us, we're green, we're helping the environment, we're also sustainable. But if you peek behind the curtain, there's not much there.
Yeah. So, for example, I'm having an argument at the moment on Instagram because this ad popped up that said our T-shirt saves the sea. Well, does that
bold claim?
Yeah, excuse me. And said, can you explain how your T-shirt saves the sea? And apparently they fund, I don't even know, like they fund picking up rubbish or something. And I went, okay, you still can't make the claim that you are saving the sea. Also, which sea are you saving? There are a number of them.
Yeah.
But that's a clear case of whether they mean to or not. I'm sure they're acting in good faith, but they've made a claim that they can't actually prove about how beneficial their product is to the environment.
And when it comes to companies and business, that's essentially really not allowed. You can't engage in decepting or misleading conduct of consumers. Is that really what's at the heart of this, that they're making these claims that they actually just can't back up? They're false.
Yeah, exactly. They might not align with science. They can't back them up. That we do have laws about what is misleading and deceptive, both in consumer law but also in our corporate law. So you can't make claims about financial products that are misleading and deceptive. So yeah, lying, essentially, exaggerating.
Apple has a plan and a promise to make Apple carbon neutral. Wait, no, we've already done that. To make every single Apple product carbon neutral by 2030.
The first generation that will live carbon neutral by our efforts against climate change.
We are committed to enhancing the sustainability of our packaging and our business.
Telstra has a responsibility to act, and we are. In our operations, we will go carbon neutral this year.
You have the power to make a difference from the moment you wake up. Power your home with the sun.
At Origin, Australia's #1 green energy provider, we're working towards a sustainable future.
What size is your carbon footprint?
And as I mentioned in the intro, we've seen the Senate is having an inquiry into greenwashing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And you gave evidence there. What kinds of things did you talk about?
Well, this inquiry was established in the context of, as you said in the introduction, sort of this global crackdown on greenwashing. So I think really civil society, consumers, investors, they're pretty fed up with the fact that every business you encounter seems to be making some pretty bold claims on climate or sustainability or on the environment. But then you look at the news or various bits of analysis that show that emissions are higher than ever, that habitat destruction is accelerating. So something's not adding up there. You're getting more net zero claims, more, circular economy claims than ever, but that's not being reflected in real life. So
yeah, if they were all true, emissions would be reducing. There's some outrageous claims being made here by companies. What are some of the things that consumers and that the Senate are really worried about here?
So we all have been told that we need to do our bit for the climate and environment, right? Origin Energy, a gas company, it had this advertising campaign that was like 100 days of action or something, or things that we could do as consumers because we're the problem. And it had suggestions like, on a hot day, don't turn on the aircon, eat an icy pole instead. And so we're all gripped with this guilt and being told by government and business that we're all in this together.
Well, and that we're the problem.
Well, we're the problem and we're all in this together. And so we should be doing things like buying our Keep Cup or getting our solar panels or recycling, if you can decipher any of what those symbols mean. And we're on the lookout for products and services that are environmentally friendly, that are going to reduce our own carbon footprint and help us collectively meet our climate targets.
We all want to be part of the solution.
We all want to be part of the solution. The problem is that you don't know what is real and what isn't. If you've got, say, Ampol saying that its petrol is carbon neutral, that sounds like a pretty good thing. Carbon neutral means you have no impact on the climate. I can barely work out what they're trying to say when they say they've got carbon neutral petrol. Like, you need to understand the scientific.
No, I think that's clear to me as a consumer. That's like saying I can buy that petrol and like I don't have to worry about my emissions.
100%.
There's something that has happened. I don't know what it is, but if I'm buying that, I'm having no climate impact. That's what I would assume with that.
Yeah, and so
like what else could carbon neutral petrol be?
And it's been certified by the Australian government, which we'll get to. So it's got a tick of approval on a number of fronts.
I just want to repeat that because I think that is outrageous. Ampol has government certified carbon neutral petrol, which, let's be clear, is not a real thing. That's not a real thing, right?
No, that's not a real thing. It's not a real thing. And in the Netherlands, there was a case against Shell for making exactly the same claims, that they were selling carbon neutral petrol, and Shell was not allowed to make those claims anymore and they weren't allowed to advertise those. But here, government
tick of approval.
Yeah, it's not just carbon neutral petrol. The Parents for Climate Action are currently litigating against Energy Australia because they've been selling carbon neutral gas and electricity for years. Telstra sells carbon neutral gas and electricity. They've become now an energy retailer. Origin, if you go to this government website, Climate Active, you can see all the fossil fuels that are being marketed as carbon neutral. And so you think as a consumer, well, I'm doing my bit here. And if a certifying body, whether it's government or voluntary, is giving it a tick of approval, you would think that that claim is legit. So, yeah. But with greenwashing, what is happening is that companies are making claims that consumers believe, but companies can't actually back them up, or they're not based in science.
So the government is supposed to protect consumers from greenwashing, and that's what these regulators are cracking down on. But that's not actually what the government is doing in practice, is it, Polly?
No, and in fact, they've just introduced a piece of legislation that features a 3-year moratorium on greenwashing litigation by the community or consumers or investors against companies.
So they're not protecting consumers from companies, they're protecting companies from the public.
Yeah.
They're protecting companies from being sued by the public and investors for making greenwashing claims.
Yes.
For how long?
3 years.
3 years.
So this legislation will probably come in 2025, I think. 3-year moratorium takes you up to about 2028. This is meant to be the critical decade for climate action. There was some UN report saying we had 2 years to get our emissions down. It's a pretty alarming headline, or the world's going to end, something like that.
Yeah.
Yet there is a 3-year period in which these companies can say pretty much anything they like and can't be, sued by the public.
Yeah.
2028, that's 2 years away from us meant to have met our 2030 target.
And this is in an environment where the government is trying to make companies do the right thing. They're trying to get them to be accountable to investors and to the public about the risks to their company from climate change. So, yeah, it's really that's pretty bad, Polly.
It's pretty bad, Eb. And the irony is that in this policy paper that Treasury put together about this legislation, it said the policy impact paper, this is saying this is what this policy will do. Climate change is a systemic risk to the financial sector that warrants heightened scrutiny. Heightened scrutiny is exactly what this provision in this legislation aims to avoid. And the rationale is that these are just Australia's biggest, most well-resourced companies.
Poor things.
These little puppies, these poor little darlings, they haven't had time, Eb, to get their heads around this, despite the fact that we've had sustainability reporting for decades, despite the fact that government's been talking about this for 2 years, despite the fact that most of these companies are already voluntarily saying that they are disclosing their climate risk. They haven't had enough time. And so big bad consumers like you or me, or First Nations people or traditional owners or investors.
You've got to shield those poor
companies.
companies.
You've got to shield them. Yes, it's not fair.
It's really tough out there for those big oil and gas companies, isn't it, Polly?
Yeah, and that's exactly the sorts of companies that are going to be protected by this legislation.
Whether it's illegal to have carbon neutral petrol, whether it's illegal for a gas company to call itself carbon neutral, and whether it should be illegal for a government or a candidate or anyone to make a claim that they take climate change seriously when they support fossil fuel expansion, that's literally up to you guys to decide, because you make laws and we don't. But the science is really clear. What the world needs to do really quickly is produce and consume a lot less fossil fuels.
You can't address greenwashing by the private sector when the government's own climate policies are facilitating some of that behaviour, I would say, or all of that behaviour.
So is that what you mean by this term that you have written about and spoken about in the past, state-sponsored greenwashing, that it's not only companies who are trying to mislead consumers or making false claims, but increasingly governments are in on the act as well?
Yeah, it's slightly different and I think worse than state-sponsored greenwash, really. Have you heard the term green hushing?
No, what's that?
If you are too critical of a business for greenwashing, the risk is that they just don't talk about doing good things at all. And so we can't be too critical of companies that are trying to do the right thing, like buying lots of offsets that might be junk.
Otherwise there won't be good PR about it.
Yes, they'll just stop talking about it and they'll stop doing anything about the environment. So I don't know, this is probably more comparable to state-sponsored greenwashing, really. It's pretty alarming, just the fact that the government would intervene to try and block kind of democratic processes and democratic participation, I think is very alarming. But what we mean by state-sponsored greenwash is kind of this policy architecture that the government has implemented that essentially it's predominantly fossil fuel companies, allow them to make green claims that are then shielded by a veneer of government regulation or government certification. So Climate Active is basically a toolkit for greenwashing. You get to buy offsets. You get to choose what you make carbon neutral.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked in the past about how there's gas companies that just certify their operations.
So like just their offices, essentially.
There was one that, they've withdrawn now, but just their offices. So they were able to make the claim of being a carbon neutral gas company.
Because just ignore all the gas they're exporting overseas to be burnt and to go up in the atmosphere. But what matters is that their little headquarters.
Yep. They're recycling and they've got their LED lights. So you get to, the government provides kind of, I guess, this framework for which bit you want to say is carbon neutral. And then it says you can either buy Australian government certified carbon offsets or you can buy from this list of international offsets. And there's been a whole lot of studies that have shown that they're very problematic as well. And then the government gives you a tick of approval and promotes your business as
carbon neutral and green.
Literally on a website it used to say progressive climate leaders. They've taken that off, but they still promote them as making a difference.
And so at the end of the day, it's pretty bad because not only is that kind of rubbish, but there's no actual change in behaviour to reduce emissions. That's the bottom line here, right?
It is cheaper to greenwash than it is to decarbonise. The other aspect is things like the safeguard mechanism where you have companies like Woodside, or actually really interestingly, so the safeguard mechanism notionally regulates heavy emitting industry, and the idea is that they have to reduce their emissions up to 2030. Last year, Minister Bowen was in Japan and he kind of said the quiet bit out loud, which was Australian gas companies can be net zero while increasing their production and also meeting their climate goals.
That's a magic pudding, if ever I've heard one.
Isn't it? So, I mean, that's kind of lays state-sponsored greenwashing there out there, because the government is saying these companies are regulated and they're meeting the requirements we have imposed on them. They're meeting their climate targets, their net zero or whatever targets. So you can't, it's kind of impenetrable, because Woodside can then go, we're doing everything the government said we had to.
And it's got a big old tick of government approval on it. So I just want to stay with this tick of approval, because it just seems the most obvious and egregious of the examples of state-sponsored greenwashing. I mean, tell us about Climate Active and this carbon neutral kind of certification scheme. You've talked about some of the issues with if Ampol just defines this one little bit of its product and buys offsets for that, then it can make this claim. I mean, what is happening with Climate Active now? Because I know you've put in some complaints about it to the regulators, or the Australia Institute has. And, we have seen some changes to this scheme. Where is that scheme at right now?
So just quick recap. Carbon neutral certification scheme run by the Australian government. It's an offsetting scheme, basically. It's been running for a number of years. It had a rebrand in 2019 as Climate Active. Businesses can certify their operations, their products, events or precincts or buildings as carbon neutral, and they develop an emissions inventory which they have to publish on the website. They're kind of meant to reduce their emissions, and then once they've reduced their emissions as much as possible, then they buy some offsets.
We saw it imperative that we became carbon neutral and got certified. There's a growing market for people wanting to live more sustainably.
Clients come to us now. They have a particular appetite for a certain level of sustainability. They're wanting it to be carbon neutral. They're wanting to...
Scopes. One of the first steps in getting certified under the Climate Active programme is to determine where you draw your carbon footprint boundary.
there's traditionally been no requirement to actually reduce emissions. You just kind of have to say that you're trying. They're then listed on the Climate Active website, and it's important to note this because the government is effectively promoting some businesses over others. So one of the issues with greenwashing is that it gives businesses an unfair competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, the Australia Institute and others have taken issue, I suppose, with some of the claims that are being made by Climate Active itself, in that they're not actually checking that the businesses are climate active.
So what do you mean?
Well, so you
get a tick, but no one peeks underneath the hood?
No. Well, do you think climate active? What do you think? Like,
I think I've got solar panels on the roof. I think I'm doing my business practices differently, so I'm not putting as many emissions in the air.
You think a business
no one checks on that?
Active on climate, don't you?
They're doing stuff.
Yeah. But
active implies I'm doing some things.
Carve off that. They're called emissions boundaries. You can carve off your offices or your product and you get a climate active carbon neutral stamp for that specific thing, but there's no due diligence done on the rest of your business to check whether your whole business is climate active, and arguably Ampol is not a climate active brand, but if you look at the Climate Active website, it talks about brands that are making a difference.
Right.
So Origin, Ampol, Qantas sells carbon neutral flights. There's so many fossil fuel companies.
Oh,
listed.
I mean, yeah, fossil fuel companies and airlines be at the top of my list for companies doing active on climate. That's not the way the government means it, though. So, Polly, essentially, like, that's kind of like me saying, well, look, if you just ignore all the chocolate cake I have for dessert and all the KFC I eat on a Friday night and the takeaway that I have on a Saturday night, I have an extremely healthy diet.
Yes, so your Mondays are certified Healthy Ebb Mondays.
Healthy Ebb Mondays.
In fact, we wouldn't even put Mondays, we'd just say Healthy Ebb Days. And that could be any day. Healthy Ebb.
Yeah.
Healthy Ebb certified.
Yeah.
That could be any day. But the kicker is, okay, so they're not checking, there's a number of kickers, God. They're not checking whether the entire business is climate active. They do risk assessments before they certify someone. It's pretty amazing that a number of these have gotten through. They don't check the veracity of the carbon credits that are being bought by these businesses to make a carbon neutral claims. They don't check whether the credits are real. And of course, as we have said countless times or shown countless times, including with our own research, there are very big looming questions over most of Australia's carbon credits.
Yep.
Internationally, looks like there's not really any that are credible. But regardless, even if there was, you'd think that this certification scheme would be checking them out. So, of course, there was that Four Corners episode about the carbon credit projects in Papua New Guinea, which showed that logging was actually increasing in areas that were meant to be getting carbon credits for not logging.
Yeah.
And those credits are being bought by climate active certified businesses.
Yeah.
And I should say a number of these businesses are doing this in good faith. Like they think, you'd think if the government's offering something.
Yeah, and they're saying this is a legit product that you can buy to meet your obligations. Like, yeah.
And you'd think someone would be checking it.
Yeah.
It's very subprime, this whole thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, so they're not checking on what the whole company is doing, if it's genuinely climate active. They're not checking the veracity of the offsets that these companies are buying. I mean, what the hell, what are they paying people to do there apart from just stick a rubber stamp
Here's another
on the
thing.
paperwork?
So in 2019, when they developed this scheme, they submitted the Climate Active certification trademark to the ACCC. There's two trademarks. There's just the one that says Climate Active, and then there's the carbon neutral stamp. And they submitted that and the standards or the rules that it's based on to the ACCC. And the ACCC never certified them. That's 2019. We're now in 2024. And in budget estimates, I think last year or maybe earlier in the year, the ACCC actually acknowledged that the reason they had never kind of given the tick of approval to this certification scheme was that it was considered too confusing for consumers. The rules were too confusing. Consumers might not know what they're getting when they see that carbon neutral trademark. So Australia's consumer watchdog has said that the government's carbon neutral certification scheme is too confusing for it to sign off on, In the meantime, Climate Active has continued to charge businesses to offer them this certification and is still making claims about it being one of the most robust certifications in the world. And this is not a direct quote, but it's something like, this gives you at a glance reassurance that what you're buying is a legitimate carbon neutral product.
Yeah.
Climate Active is a highly trusted certification program which is administered by the Commonwealth Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources.
And so it sounds, Polly, like Climate Active is not very healthy, shall we say.
Climate Active is not active. It's climate inactive.
Yeah. So what needs to happen for this to become genuine? How do we stop industry and government making misleading environmental claims?
It's a really good question. And this is what the Australia Institute has demonstrated, is that greenwashing is actually a symptom of regulatory failure, or a whole lot of quite complex, interacting, but also contradictory policies and regulations. So if you've got a government that is still subsidising fossil fuels and still approving and endorsing them, giving money to them, that is, if we talk about subsidies alone, that's money that's not going to legitimate decarbonisation. So until the government itself actually is committed to genuine decarbonisation, you're not going to be finding the private sector, what is it, do what I say? No, I don't want to be But my point is that if we had policies that meant that businesses actually had to reduce their emissions in the absolute sense, or not harm the environment, then this would be far less of an issue. So businesses don't often advertise the fact that they don't use slave labour or child labour, so you should choose us, because that's law. We just know that it is illegal to use child labour.
Yeah.
So we don't look for brands that are promoting themselves as not using child labour.
Yeah. So they don't stick that on the posters.
So they don't stick it on the posters. Yeah. We are not human traffickers. Like, people aren't advertising that because that is illegal. If corporations or the private sector or industry actually had to reduce their emissions, they actually had to disclose what they were doing, and we were still allowed to sue them if they lied about it, then we would know that every business is having to do the same thing, essentially. We wouldn't have to be trying to
weigh up all these competing
claims because it should just be law.
And you should be able to just see, is that companies' emissions going up or down?
Yeah, up or down, and ideally they should all be going down. And so green claims should not be a selling point or give a business a competitive advantage, because why are businesses still allowed to do damage in the first place? So, it's really great that there is a crackdown on greenwashing, but it is indicative of a much bigger systemic issue, and having laws around green claims or even a legislated definition of greenwashing, while welcome, is a kind of a band-aid approach. And until we, I suppose, release the grip that the fossil fuel industry or other polluting industries have on our democracy, we're probably not going to make much headway in terms of addressing those.
Well, yeah, what you're essentially saying is, like, until the government's policies reflect its rhetoric, and what we've committed to, which is reducing Australia's emissions, like, until all our policies align behind that and they stop approving new fossil fuel projects and all of that kind of stuff, it's really, greenwashing is just the Band-Aid that we're slapping on that.
Yeah,
so it's not an open wound the government has to worry about.
And until the government stops making it cheaper for businesses to greenwash than legitimately decarbonise, they're going to keep choosing that option. Of course, they're going to choose
why wouldn't you? That makes
yummy
sense.
Buffet of the old international wind credits and a carbon neutral stamp than they are investing in energy efficiencies. That stuff's really expensive, and it's not being scaled up because we don't have the policies that are actually
that are going to
do
support
that.
it.
Yeah. Until the government itself is committed to absolute emissions reduction, until the government itself stops greenwashing, then we've got very little chance of addressing greenwashing by industry. But I should say it's not all hopeless. The fact that we've got this Senate inquiry, the fact that we do have civil society taking legal action against companies.
The fact that the ACCC didn't certify this, what is clearly a dodgy scheme.
Yeah.
Our hopes and dreams and lives are being washed away by a flood of greenwashing and lies.
There are signs that tolerance is waning, and yes, that not being allowed to sue companies is very alarming, but we've got a federal election coming up, and consumer intolerance coupled with voter intolerance, I think, on lack of climate action means that we could actually get change at the next election, and that would go a long way, not only to addressing greenwashing, but actually resulting in absolute emissions reductions and decarbonisation, the way that we already say that we're doing, but actually doing it.
Yeah, and I guess if we come back to kind of where we started out, I mean, people, consumers, if we're wanting to do the right thing, you should be able to purchase something with like a certification on it and be confident that you're getting what you paid for until we can just kind of resolve that,
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Polly, for drawing attention to this issue, and thanks for taking us through all the little nooks and crannies of how governments and companies are trying to pull the wool over our eyes. And we will watch the future of climate active and greenwashing and the outcomes of this inquiry with interest. It certainly seems like it's well past time that it happened.
It does. Thanks, Seb.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.